Hello guys, it's Gabi from Genial Care again. Today we have a genial conversation with Dr. Erin Lozott, behavior analyst and speech-language pathologist. Me and Lílian talked with Dr. Erin about AAC importance in children with ASD and other disabilities. So let's start. Thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
And to start with, I want to ask, during all your journey as a speech therapist, what are the biggest changes that you see in the AAC field in the United States and around the world?
Okay, so those are big questions. Thank you for having me, Gabby and Lillian. It's nice to see you, and thank you to Genial Care. I think to start, my journey has been a bit unique, so my perspective may be different than what anyone else in the world, may think. Because I've been a speech language pathologist for many, many years, and now I'm a doctorate level board certified behavior analyst as well. My perspective comes from two different fields of discipline. In addition to having my doctorate in special education, I'm also then looking at through a third lens when I think about augmentative and alternative communication. I would say that what I see is that very infrequently when I've traveled around the world, has there been a strong knowledge base in the providers that I've worked with regarding that there is a very comprehensive assessment process that goes into making decisions related to augmentative and alternative communication. This then directly impacts the implementation. Because if you don't know, or your understanding of the assessment process is limited, and it doesn't have all the components that are essential in an AAC, if you will, augmentative and alternative communication, which we call in the US AAC, I believe in Brazil it's CAA. If you don't have that as a standardized process that you're going through, that's obviously then individualized per each child, then you may just choose a system, a high-tech system, or choose a no-tech system for a child without really having the information necessary to make that decision. And then the results of that may not be positive, which then I think is what's happened. My perspective is this is what's happened historically, is that people will say, either AAC doesn't work or develop lots of misunderstandings or myths about AAC as not only an intervention strategy or a tool to be used, but also just the field in itself. So what I see is that the biggest difference in looking at the United States in comparison, not to say that everybody does everything perfect in the United States, and we have our moments being in America, but to say that there is a common knowledge, a commonly known practice that you would never recommend an AAC system or strategy without evaluating the individual's speech and language skills, the individual's hearing and vision skills, the individual's motor skills and motor coordination skills, positioning of the individual and access to a device. You would never make a decision on a system without going through an entire feature matching process that really looks at and outlines every line item that you should be paying attention to and assessing, ensuring that what communicative competencies that are specific and necessary prerequisites for accessing, let's say, this type of system versus that type of system are in place. And there's also then a misunderstanding that you have to have a prerequisite to have a communication system recommended for you. So if you don't have that piece and you're not looking at the child as a whole, and you're not working with a team of providers when across disciplines, when you are doing an evaluation, then you're only looking at one piece of a very large detailed picture or picture scene. So your decision that you're making for that person is probably going to be missing the rest of the story. And then the outcome when you're planning for intervention is going to be that you're only targeting one piece of a larger kind of puzzle, if you will, for no other better term. And so what I see in other countries that I've gone to that's very unique to countries that don't have this mentality or knowledge base, I should say, for a comprehensive assessment and a team approach to augmentative and alternative communication, is that typically people have very, very clear misunderstandings that fall into different categories. One is that everybody has to start with a PEC system or something no tech before they could actually go to high tech, which is a false statement, right? It's a false belief. So you can start with a high tech system with a child who has never accessed PECs. That is all based on the features that match this child's needs and access to communication. And that's a decision that's made with a team throughout an evaluation process. There's also a very large, I guess, myth or misnomer that too many pictures on the front page, if you do a communication board, whether it's no tech, low tech, mid tech, high tech, it equates to complexity, and a beginning AAC user would never have more than 1 or 2 or 4 pictures on a page. That's not correct. That's not a rule, actually, but people have made this a rule. I've also seen where people recommend a specific application on, let's say, an iPad or a tablet, and they've just decided that's the one they use, and they will only use this one, so that's the one that the child gets, without ever having evaluated the needs and the skills of the child across domains of development and AAC, and with no trials of systems or strategies. Another area when it comes to assessment which impacts implementation, it seems like there's everybody thinks that when you say augmentative and alternative communication, it means a full-fledged comprehensive communication system. Like let's say you have touch chat or Proloquo to go, which is not yet in Portuguese, or cough drop, or something that's created by Toby Dynavox, like Snap Core First or now Core First. Speak for Yourself, LAMP, that's now a consistent motor, accessed by consistent motor planning. Everybody thinks of that. So when you say AAC, you think an app on an iPad that has all of these components, when in actuality, you have unaided and aided systems and strategies that fall under this umbrella term of AAC. And you could have a person who only needs a few strategies some of the time. You can have a person that needs strategies and a comprehensive system. You can have a person that needs a system and doesn't need all the strategies because the system embeds them. This in itself is a message to send to especially families as well as providers that it's not a one size fits all. There is a comprehensive assessment process. There are strategies and systems. AAC is not just for people that are nonverbal or minimally verbal. It can also benefit people who are verbal because it's either supposed to supplement or augment a communication. So an example would be that if a person is verbal, but when highly stressed or highly excited, breaks down in their ability to effectively communicate, maybe I need that in that moment, right? To have access to that. And so I think that the field in itself is really well understood in certain pockets of professionals in the United States, and it's very well misunderstood across the world. And the information, unfortunately, hasn't yet been translated literally into Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish and Italian and Mandarin, all these other languages, to the extent where if you're not bilingual or you're not trained in one of these pockets in the US of these people we consider the gurus of AAC and the experts in the world, then you only know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And so it's with all good intention, if someone even attempts to want to use a form of AAC, however, the results of only knowing what you know and moving forward as though you're an expert are often where a child will get stuck or a professional gets stuck. And then there's frustration that comes from this. And then people don't feel that this is an effective intervention or when it isn't evidence-based intervention. And so that's where trying with good intent without truly the knowledge for assessment and intervention comes to a place where it can have some negative results, because children either abandon their device or adults find it to be aversive because it's not being used properly, or the supports matching that person's learning needs and development were just never in place for them to be able to develop. So it just seems like the tool didn't work, the system didn't work, the strategies didn't work. And AAC is no different than a piano or a hammer, right? You can't put a piano. There's a famous quote, I think, that you can't put a piano in front of someone and expect them to know how to play. And so the piano is just there until someone teaches them how to use it. You don't know what to do with a hammer unless someone has shown you how to use the hammer to hang up a picture, to hammer a nail. And we I think, take that for granted when it comes to, from no tech to high tech, the tools that are used within the concept of AAC.
So actually, the next question is two questions in one. It's because a lot of parents of children with autism have difficulties dealing with disruptive behaviors. And the first question about it is how these disruptive behaviors are connected with the lack of functional communication. And the second question is how AAC can help.
Excellent questions. Thank you so much. So they're one and the same, right? Behavior is communication. Communication is behavior. There's no question about that. There's science to support that. And that is, I think, where the world gets stuck, is that we don't look at a child's behavior as sending a communicative message. We look at it often from the surface of what the topography or what the behavior looks like and how you describe it. So he's throwing, he's hitting, he's kicking, right? You can time it, you can observe it, you can count it. What we need to look at is, what is this behavior communicating to me? And if we look through the lens of communication, not just the underlying function of the behavior, but the communicative message that's paired or aligned with that behavior, then we can assess, program, and plan for the ability, the use of AAC, whether it's, again, a strategy and a system or a whole system. We can plan for that to help mitigate the need to have to communicate through challenging behaviors, or what we would call maladaptive behaviors. We can help support the development of conventional communication and coping skills using AAC. The biggest difficulty is teaching professionals and parents that how to look at behavior and describe it in behavioral terms, so we're not adding our emotions to it or using terms that can't be observed, timed, and counted, and can't be then quantified to, take data and show progress. But also simultaneously looking to that behavior on, what is this individual actually communicating through the only way maybe at that moment that that person has the ability to communicate their message. And I think this goes back to understanding the Bill of Rights of communication, right? And that every person has the right to communicate however they can in that moment and be responded to as a communicator. And I think that we teach, especially in autism, historically in my journey, a lot of people how to request for things. Sometimes we teach them how to answer questions. Sometimes we teach them how to ask questions. Sometimes we teach them a social comment, but almost never do I see goals to teach people how to protest, how to refuse, right? We teach yes all day long, but we teach I want and can I have and please and thank yous of the world. But how many times do you see intensive programming and teaching a person how to say, no, I don't like it, get it away from me, please stop, this is bothering me, I'm annoyed, I feel frustrated with you in the middle of a therapy session. And so if we're not programming and planning for this, and we're not giving the child the right, we're almost preventing the right to protest, then you're going to see a person who's human letting you know how they feel about what you're doing or what's happening to them in that moment. And so AAC can absolutely provide a mode or method of communication to allow this person to communicate a message that may otherwise come out in a challenging or maladaptive behavior in a more conventional manner. So we can positively reinforce and reward that person for their hard work and their clear communication in a conventional way, safe way. However, it doesn't, that's the outcome or the, that we're having to work on. Functional communication training is a consequence-based response to having a behavior that you then have to replace that behavior with something more functional. If we took more of an antecedent-based intervention, a preventative mode, and we looked at development and we programmed for communication upfront to try to mitigate the challenging behaviors, we may not be in this place. Not to say that functional communication training isn't wonderful, because there's a lot of evidence to support the efficacy of it. But functional communication training is not AAC. Functional communication training can integrate augmentative and alternative communication components into it or strategies and systems into it, but it's not the same as AAC. It's a behaviorally based, evidence-based intervention for replacing a behavior with more functional communication means. It doesn't have to be that you may be using unaided AAC if you're using a gesture, right? Versus using your own body to communicate in a more conventional way. So it's still technically you're using a strategy of AAC, or it could be aided and it could be no tech to high tech. But if you're saying in the world of AAC and behavior analysis, you have to understand what AAC is and what it's not, what functional communication is and what it's not, and how you can integrate the two versus thinking that they're one, right? And you also have to understand the intervention planning for the target skills that are missing, that are not programmed for. So even if you replace this behavior with this, does this individual have the prerequisite and foundational skills from a social communication standpoint and language standpoint to actually not have to have you then do functional communication training on each individual behavior that pops up to replace it one by one? Because if we came from this side and we were giving this person a foundation of social communication and language, and we built in the AAC into that development, would this actually be necessary? Maybe, but maybe not as much as it is now, because we're responding to the behaviors to create the functional communication training plan most of the time. I just wanted to say this has been where we have felt that at Els for Autism specifically, but also I think in my practice, just as a practitioner in general, is that there has to be more research in how we combine these things and how families learn and professionals learn. So one of the things that I have tried to do in my world that now I'm this unicorn, right? That's what they call BCBASLPs, because for all intents and purposes, we're not supposed to marry these fields, even though when they're married and we have a strong marriage, they're just a beautiful kind of combination that always should have been together. We do a lot of research here on the Ruby Parent Training Program in order to understand how to best implement this parent training to, in a clinical practice, in a community viable, cost-effective way. And through telehealth, so people all over the world can have access. And so we've recently published a paper on our study of Ruby in a kind of community viable clinical practice in a one-on-one setting. And then we just finished a multi-site global telehealth Ruby project in a group format. And we're continuing to expand our research with Ruby, because what we find is if we can get parents in early enough, so even pre-diagnosis, or while we're just diagnosed but haven't started intervention, parents of children that don't yet have behaviors, and we can teach them the foundational skills that they need to understand about behavior, and how if they start to see something happening, they can come in preventatively and teach new skills and integrate AAC strategies and systems, or functional communication, training and opportunities. That we have found Ruby parent training to be preventative in the sense, versus waiting till someone has mild to moderate challenging behaviors and then training the parents when they're, the original studies I think were on, families of children 3 to 7+ years of age. And we know that all the way up to 11 years of age, Ruby is very effective. But we're taking parents of 2-year-olds, right? And even in our early intensive behavior intervention program, we're having Ruby as the first step into parent training to make sure that parents know how to understand how to look at behaviors, communicate about behaviors, understand communication and where it falls, understand the concept of AAC and functional communication training, to not just manage those behaviors, but hopefully prevent them from coming on, and already know how to program and plan and be able to be a collaborative partner with their providers in the intervention process. And so our 2-year-olds that are turning 3 are hopefully not already having the onset or having the byproduct of challenging behaviors because of a lack of development in communication. And the parents are already putting in these natural practices that become part of their daily life in order to support their child's development, so that their child does not need to communicate through maladaptive behaviors any more than a child without autism would need to. And so this research, I think it's really pretty incredible, because Ruby is a wonderful program to teach people a foundational set of skills that can make changes in their knowledge and development, so the parents can become an agent of change for their own child and a good consumer of interventions. And then once they have that solid base of this information, of course, we're going to have to expand and, do something that's more individualized for them. But when you start parent training without a strong base, and you're kind of going per discipline, let's say problem of the day, there's no thread that weaves through the concepts that parents they didn't go to school for this. And so then they're going, okay, like Lillian, you're my speech pathologist, work with me on communication. This is the problem. Gabby, maybe you're my behavior analyst, work with me on this problem. And now I'm not really learning a set of strategies or concepts that I can support my child's development overall, because I'm just piecemealing per the item. And so this is where this has really changed how we've looked at parent training, and why Ruby is considered such an effective and evidence-based parent training program. And so we're excited to continue to blend these fields and engage parents in learning.
My last question, because Lillian has some questions for you too, is about child development. A lot of studies have shown that early interventions play a key role in acquiring new skills and also achieving autonomy and independence. How to ensure AAC early intervention, and what criteria do you consider to indicate AAC in very young children?
So a couple things that we want to talk about when we're talking about the early integrating AAC into early intervention and the development of a child's communication skills. First and foremost, going back to that, is doing that assessment and understanding where they're at right away with social communication, with their receptive understanding of language, their expressive output of language, right? Their social use of language, like their pragmatics. So once you have a baseline of information on their cognitive abilities, their vision and hearing, all of that, then you can look at, what's called lights which is the researcher, 4 areas of communicative competence. And when you're looking at these things, you're looking at a child's linguistics, so their language skills. You're looking at the operational skills that are necessary for whatever type of strategy and system you want to integrate into this child's world, and what their skill sets, how well of a match they are to the needs for what you're recommending. So let me give you an example. If you have a little boy or a little girl who's 2 or 3 years old in a preschool program or getting intensive intervention, and someone recommends that they have to have a direct access to a high-tech device, like, let's just say, cough drop. But this child possibly has motor issues where they can't accurately extend their finger to make a point to then get access to that device because of a physical impairment or a motor planning impairment. And they don't have any other way that's programmed for them to select, but direct selection to that high tech. Or maybe their finger is not strong enough, and the pressure that it takes to hold and how long it takes to hold on that mid-tech device, because you really have to push to get the sound to come out. They don't have the strength yet to do that. Then that's probably going to make it very difficult for that person to access that communication. And if you're 2 and your motor skills are still developing, and we give you something that's too hard for what you can do based on where you're at developmentally, that's not a fair playing field, and that's going to be important to understand. So if you also look at the symbol system and let's say the pictures, if you're using symbols, right, and the device, the symbols are necessary, so you're accessing communication based on the symbols, right, versus based on a consistent motor plan, but you haven't learned that pictures represent objects or things in real life, and you're still pre-symbolic. Not that you can't start with symbols, but the professional needs to know that for someone young, so that the goals that you're working on are connected to developing these prerequisite language skills that would make someone more successful, right? You have to look at the social competencies that relate to AAC, okay? So you have to look at, is a child showing any intent to communicate yet? Or is it all prompted? And we don't prompt initiation of communication. We don't prompt intent. That is a very large misunderstanding worldwide when it comes to the use of AAC. We don't ever take someone's hand before they start to show intention and prompt them to press something. That would be in the realm of more of a facilitated communication, not what we consider true AAC. And then there's strategic competencies that we have to look at when it comes to AAC, that AAC users, these compensatory strategies that AAC users have to have in place to overcome a communication breakdown. What happens if you have a device that needs to be plugged in and it's no longer charged? How do you still communicate your message? What's the backup plan? So when we're talking about the earliest stages of intervention with our little ones, all of these areas of communicative competencies need to be assessed, addressed, and there should be target goals in each of these areas that we're directly working on when we're working on the development of communication if AAC is required. And then going back to the first thing that I said about these misunderstandings, just because you're 2 or 3 doesn't mean that you get less pictures on your front page. It doesn't mean that you can't have non-picture words. It doesn't mean that you can't come from a core vocabulary approach versus kind of this fringe only, all the nouns of the word of like just your cookies and your favorite items. So oftentimes when we start with the mentality or the philosophy, excuse me, of this I want plus a noun, PECS is a functional communication system. It is not a robust AAC system. Then we're kind of building out skills that go against the grain for what early language and social communication development need to be able to expand and how AAC would be, when we integrate AAC, how it will become effective versus ineffective for a child. And so early intervention, when done properly, does make a huge difference. We know that in a child's development, the integration of AAC into that child's intervention plan, into that child's educational experiences is essential, as long as it is done in a way that really develops communication versus is used as a response tool, or only develops a carrier phrase that's scripted plus a noun without creating this concept of subject verb agreement or subject verb noun agreement and across all functions of communication, so that a child can actually use the system to communicate and it can build language. And I think that that's where we get stuck is I see in programs and plans for early intervention, Gabby, that you have a requesting goal and it's going to be through PECs. And so we say that we integrate AAC into this program, but it's only for this goal for these items. And AAC should be integrated across the child's life, right? And it should be to comment, to request, to clarify, to ask questions, to answer, to initiate, to protest, to, be social for social's sake. It's an expressive output system that, yeah, you could respond to something, but it should be in the child's intent. The other thing with early intervention that will make a difference when it comes to AAC is that we often, I don't see this a lot in other countries. I see it a lot in the US, but not as much as it should be. This concept of having a communication partner and a partner system in place. The parent or the educator or the clinician should have their own set of words that they're modeling for the child on to highlight their own language, as well as to give a model of how to use this system effectively. For some reason, even though it is known through the research and practice that people learn from others, right? We learn from imitation, we learn by models. AAC seems to be the one thing that we never think to model for a child. So you get one communication board, one set of pictures, one communication book, one iPad, and you give it to this child who's already vulnerable, right? And at a disadvantage because they have autism or some other developmental delay impacting their communication development. And you say basically like, here, let me teach you how to use this and never show you it and never use it myself. And let's figure out how fast you're going to learn. And I say this, in jest, but this is significant when there's an entire part of the field of AAC that has research supporting the need and the efficacy of aided language stimulation, modeling of language, focused language stimulation that is never discussed or used. And actually, I've had conversations with people in different countries that have told me, we don't do that in this country. I said, this is not an opinion. This is not a choice. This is a field of practice and study that has determined this is how someone needs to learn. And so you can't not do it. But a lot of times you don't see our young children having access to communication partners that have their own systems that are mirrors of the child's system to be able to learn from others how this could be used in a more conventional way to expand communication. So our kids get stuck early on, as well as our professionals do. And I'm hoping that this talk and the work that's being done by some of the, or even, the parent groups in Brazil specifically and around the world will help change that, because the need for the teacher to be modeling and highlighting their language and showing a child how to communicate in a total communication mode. So pictures here, words here, this is something that's going to change the trajectory of our younger children into later life. The other thing is that in EI, in early intervention, when people do go to model language on a device, no one ever speaks while they're touching the device that's speaking. So how would a child know that the expectation is when kids with autism learn what you learn to how you teach them to who teaches them, very literal minded, the child could very well, someone would say, oh, well, it's going to stop him from talking. Well, did your model include that the expectation of that he should be talking? And it's really pretty incredible when the models include that the expectation is that you can talk and use your device, that kids start to talk and use their device if they have the capacity to speak. Okay. And so I think that a lot of this, if we were to educate those providers and those parents early on and engage them in the realities of AAC, what the literature actually says, what we know from practice to be true, then the early intervention would look very different and the outcomes would be significant. If we don't do this and we don't learn this, then we may get stuck still in certain areas, and it's not going to be because of the it's not Proloco's fault. And it's not because AAC is bad and makes kids stop talking. It's because the teaching process was never outlined, and the knowledge behind the development of the teaching process didn't have all the right components to allow for a child to learn correctly. Gabby, the last part of your question, when you talked about how can we ensure the early indication of AAC and early intervention, we can ensure it by what I just said, the education piece and making sure families and providers have the knowledge they need to know that it should just be naturally integrated into a child's plan versus feeling that you have to not speak or see a behavior before you integrate it. The criteria to consider, what criteria do you consider to indicate AAC in very young children, is that there is no criteria. There is no prerequisite to beginning giving a child access to a voice or access to the ability to communicate in a way that makes sense for that child, no matter if they are 18 months, 15 months, 2 or 3, because remember, AAC can be unaided or aided. So if you're giving child access to gestures, that's unaided AAC. If you're teaching the child to move their body closer with a facial response and change their face to communicate, that's AAC. If you're giving person aided access to aided communication or AAC, it very well could be objects that they're using with maybe a real photo paired with it to transition from an object to a picture with a word. So there's no time like the present. And as soon as a child is deemed as having a communication delay or disorder, we should be already ahead of the game in doing this. This is not a wait and see game where they have to have a certain set of skills. What we need to do is assess their skills so we can program and plan accordingly and not skip steps, but not because the assessment is going to say yes or no. So I hope that that helps clarify that piece.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. Now it's Lilian's time. She's going
Okay.
to ask you some questions too.